Hello and welcome to the Agile Innovation Leaders podcast. I'm Ojiaku. On this podcast, I speak with world-class leaders and doers about themselves and a variety of topics spanning agile, lean innovation, business, leadership, and much more, with actionable takeaways for you, the listener. Welcome back to the Agile Innovation Leaders podcast. This is part 2 of my conversation with Brian McDonald. In part 1, we discussed defining a story, why we tell stories, among other things. And in this second part, Brian shares more of his insights around the storytelling formula, Brian's upcoming memoir, and building a story's armature.
So the story spine are 7 steps that you need to create a story. They use it at Pixar. I've worked with them quite a bit, so we speak similar language,
It's been such an honor to learn from Brian, and I hope you find part 2 of our conversation as insightful as I have. Everyone is a storyteller. Everyone has a story to tell. And knowing how to structure it is key to making it impactful and, helping people to get information that heals, that helps them survive, that helps them navigate the conflicts of this world. So you, in your book, Invisible Ink, you gave us a storytelling formula. Do you mind sharing that with us?
So the story spine are 7 steps that you need to create a story. They use it at Pixar. I've worked with them quite a bit, so we speak similar language, me and them. But they use this too. And I think we basically learned it from the same source. Rebecca Stokely is the woman who ultimately brought it into my world, but sort of indirectly through a guy named Matt Smith. So they are once upon a time and every day until one day. And because of this, and because of this, until finally, and ever since that day. So they are once upon a time and every day, until one day, and because of this, and because of this, until finally, and ever since that day. And that's sort of, you set up the status quo, this is what happened, this is who this person is, this is what they want, whatever it is, and then something changes, right? Now you're into till one day, right? And the second act, that would be the first act. The second act would be, it's the body of the story. It's really what people say the story is about. So that's the longest part. That's why it's sort of split in 2 in a way, because of this and because of this. There are some people who will add more because of this, but I don't. Some people don't like that I'm so rigid about it. But what I find is that the hardest thing I teach people is how to simplify. That's the hardest thing. Adding more details is easy. Simplifying is hard. So that's why I stick with those 7 and because of this and because of this. And then until finally, now you're into the third act. And ever since that day, because the third act is all about the conclusion or the resolution, but the conclusion. But the way I like to think about the 3 acts is this. I had been thinking about it this way. And this is something that I don't know where Hitchcock got it, but Alfred Hitchcock talked about it. But I've never heard it anywhere else. So it's proposal, argument, conclusion. That's the way stories work. And those are the 3 acts: proposal, argument, conclusion. Now, it's the way people talk. That's why it works. So the proposal is, let's say I say, Saturday I went the best party I've ever been to in my life. That's my proposal. Everybody knows what comes next. My proof. This happened, that happened, this star was there, this blah, 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 whatever it is, whatever my argument is that this is the best party in the world, right? And then the conclusion, often stories are circular, so you'll come back around to the beginning again. So that's the best party I've ever been to. Then I talk about it, and then I say, oh, what a great party. Oh, that was the best party I've ever been to. Whatever it is. It's the way we speak. That's why it works in stories, because it's natural. Right? It's the way a legal argument is constructed. Your Honor, my client is innocent, right? Then the trial, which is all proof, right? And then the conclusion is, as you can see, my client is innocent, right? That's the conclusion of that argument. But the resolution is, do they go to jail or not? And that may or may not matter to your story, right? Depending on the story you're telling. So therapists, they'll say, well, we tell ourselves the story that I'm not good enough. We tell ourselves a story that, I'm not attractive enough or whatever it is, right? And they say that's not a story. That's a conclusion that you have derived from stories, right? It's not a story. That's a conclusion. The conclusion is, I'm not worthy. I'm not smart, whatever it is. But there are stories that make you think that or feel that, right? That's where the stories are. And so the problem is, if you have different definitions for stories, I found this when I'm collaborating, if I'm working for a studio or a video game company or something, if we have a different definition for story, then we are miscommunicating from the very beginning of the conversation, right? So they maybe will say, well, we should do this. And well, that doesn't fit the story. Well, I think it does. Oh, well, we're not talking about the same thing. So the thing is, people can take my definition or leave it. That doesn't matter to me. But they ought to have a definition. And it ought to get results consistently. That's, and then you can make sure everybody's on the same page.
What I'm hearing you say is it's important to take time to define the terms being used, because that makes things easier when you're collaborating with people. So how do you then approach it?
It depends. Sometimes I come in and my job is to lecture the group. Okay. And that is to give them that shared definition and understanding of story. So sometimes that's my job. If I come in on a specific project to help on a specific project, that's usually because either they've heard me lecture before or they've read my books and we already have a shared definition. So that's usually how it works.
Okay.
Most of the time.
What would you advise when you're getting into a new collaboration with people? Would you say take the time to define the terms, and what exactly generally would you say?
I would probably let them struggle with the definition of story first, because I think that's an important part of the process. Because the people have to know they were given something, because it sounds obvious when you say it, right? So we will fool ourselves and think, oh, I knew that. So the struggle is really important. So I would let them struggle, make sure they understood that they got something. Oh, now I have a definition. And sometimes just having a definition elevates what you're able to do. Yeah, and then I would break down story. I would break down Armature, which I haven't done yet. I don't believe in the concept of interactive stories. I think that's a misnomer. Because once you interact with the story, it becomes a game. I don't think they can occupy the same space. The word story comes from the word history. A story has happened. So, for instance, you and I were somewhere and we had some crazy adventure, right? As it's happening, it is not a story. It's only a story when we're done and we tell people about it. A video game is happening in the moment, the same way as any other experience, right? It's an experience, but it's not a story till it's done and you're telling people about it, right? And so I just don't think they occupy the same space. Now, they have a lot of the same ingredients, and that's what fools people. So, for instance, it's sort of like I always say, you can use eggs and flour to make noodles or cake, but noodles are not cake, right? And so because you can have characters and settings and scenes and a lot of the same ingredients as a story, I think people think they're the same thing, but they are not. And that's what's interesting to me, is that video game people desperately want their thing to be story, and I don't know why. It's like, no, you have your own thing. They have scenarios. In the old silent movie days, they didn't have screenplays. They didn't write screenplays. Buster Keaton would say, get me a fire truck and I'll make a movie. So he would make it up. Chaplin did the same thing. They would make it up. Oh, wow. They didn't write them down. Yeah. Sometimes Chaplin would shoot and then say, okay, everybody has a week off while I figure out what happens next. He didn't. Oh, so the reason they started writing screenplays, one of them was to budget. Well, what do you want? Well, I'm going to need a truck. I'm going to need this. I'm going to need that. Okay. So they knew how much it was going to cost to make it. That's one of the reasons they started doing it. So you'll see on old silent movies, scenario by. So it would be like, what if a guy robs a bank and this happens? So that's a scenario. Video games have a scenario, right? And anything can happen in that scenario because the player has some agency. And that's like being in real life. Well, being in real life is not a story. It's a story later. But I think that when we are experiencing a story, it feels like the present. And so I think it's confusing. They'll argue with me and they'll say, but have you played this video game or that video game or this one? And I'm like, You're not actually arguing. There's a little bit of story.
Yes.
And that stops. And then there's gameplay. They don't occupy the same space. They're just close to each other, right? You have to switch from one to the other. I just don't believe they can occupy the same space. And I think technology has fooled us to thinking that that's the case, because you don't need technology. If there is such a thing as interactive stories, you could do that without technology. Choose Your Own Adventure books were that,
yes,
right? Everybody remembers them, but how many people ever tell the story of a Choose Your Own Adventure book? You ever heard anybody say, oh, no, no one does, because it wasn't really a story. It was a game. And there's nothing wrong with it being a game, right? You know, I think that's totally fine. Now, I don't study games. I work with game people. There are people who study games, and that's their whole thing. I get that. And there's game theory, and there's a bunch of stuff I don't know. But they seldom study story. And I do know that. So when they say, well, this game has a story, I'm telling you, it doesn't, because that's my field of study. So my first jobs in LA were working in creature shops because he could get me these jobs. And this is before CGI and computers and stuff. So things had to be built. My roommate was working on the movie Predator when I moved there, I remember. It was called Hunter. I still have the script. It was called Hunter at the time. They had gone on location and shot the movie without having a design for the creature. So they came back and they were doing some shoots in studio and stuff with this creature. So I remember that vividly. Anyway, but they had to build these things. And so I would work on these movies. I worked on a zombie movie and a movie called Night of the Creeps and all this. But you had to make things. And I would watch these sculptors, amazing sculptors, sculpt these little maquettes of whatever the creature was. And I'd never seen in real life somebody really able to sculpt something that was so amazing. And I was 21 years old. It was amazing to see. They would make, though, this wireframe skeleton before they sculpted the clay. And I asked why. I didn't know. And they said, well, we have to make a skeleton, an armature. In fact, the wire is called armature wire. We have to make this armature because clay can't support its own weight. And so after a little while, could be a day or 2 days or sometimes a few hours, it'll collapse upon itself. So you need to make this skeleton. And I thought, oh, that's really interesting. It's something I never thought about. And when I thought about it in terms of story, I realized that the story has an armature. It holds everything up. Everything is built around this armature. It ends up being one of the most important parts, like with the clay, right? But it's not anything anybody notices. It's the thing that makes it work. It's the thing that makes it stable. And the armature for a story is your point. What's the survival information you're trying to convey, right? So some people would call it a theme. It's a mushy word, right? People don't quite know what it means. So I usually start with armature, then I use theme interchangeably, right? But I start with armature because it's a visual idea that people can sort of wrap their brain around, where theme is, I think, almost too intellectual. The way I like to think of it is this, that a story doesn't have a theme. This is what you hear this. Stories have a theme. This story has to have a theme. Stories don't have a theme. Stories are a theme. Stories are a manifestation of the theme. If you are telling the story of King Midas and you're saying some things are more important than gold, then the story is a manifestation of the illustration of that theme.
So if the story is a manifestation of a theme and an armature is your point you're trying to make, so what is a theme then?
Well, theme and armature are the same.
Okay.
It's just that theme takes a long time for people to wrap their brains around. It's too intellectual. I think a lot of terms for storytelling and writing and all of that were made up by people who weren't practitioners, but observers. And so their words are often not very helpful, right? So it's like, well, theme's not a helpful word. I struggled with the idea of theme for a long time. Even though I knew what a theme was, I was lucky because of the things that influenced me would always have a strong theme. And so I knew instinctually how to do it. It was a while before I understood what I was doing. And the word theme completely confused me because it was something I thought I had to put in my story, right? I had to fit it in there.
If I said a theme is the point you're trying to make, or a theme is the message you're trying to pass across, am I missing the point here? Would that be wrong?
You know, the interesting thing about having a point is that when we talk, we have no problem with the concept, right? And in fact, when somebody's talking to you and it's clear they don't have a point, you lose interest fast, right?
Very true.
You also don't know what to listen for. So one of the things that often comes up is people will talk about, I think mood, for instance, is a trick of literature. So because you can paint pretty pictures with words and you can do these things, I think that's a trick and has nothing to do with storytelling. It's almost a special effect. And so sometimes people will say, well, what about mood? You know, because you're so into story. What about mood? Well, here's the thing. Nobody talks in real life about mood, right? So if I say to you, hey, Ula, I have something to tell you. A clear blue sky, seagulls in the distance, the sun beating down on me, salt air coming off the ocean. Okay, I'll see you later. You'd be like, I didn't tell you anything, right? But if I just add one sentence, if I say, my trip to Mexico was amazing, clear blue sky, right? Now you know why you're listening, right? That changes everything. The Armature does the same thing. If you know why you're telling the story, it will all fall together in a different way. And people know they're in good hands then. They feel it. They won't know why, you know, but they'll understand why they're listening.
People in other disciplines have to give presentations, and already it's an established case that storytelling helps with engaging people. And when you know the point you're trying to pass across, it's a great starting point to know, okay, what message you're trying to pass across to the audience. What advice would you give to leaders? What can they bear in mind about weaving in stories so that it's engaging without losing the message?
You know, I've helped people write speeches, and I've had to give speeches on different things that were not necessarily story related. And in fact, when I was at the creative agency I was at, we would often be asked to help people write speeches. And all the writers would follow basically the rules that I laid down about how that should happen. And we could do it really quickly. And the CEOs were always amazed at how quickly we could do it. But they usually have a story. They just don't recognize it. Most people don't recognize the stories that they have to tell because they take them for granted. And so often we would pull that out of them and say, that's your thing. But I once heard an interview. This is pre-pandemic. So pre-pandemic, there were a lot of people who were against vaccines, even then, right? And I heard this doctor talking on the radio, and the doctor said, because people were afraid. They were like, well, wait, if my kid gets the vaccines, you know, gets immunized, that's what they thought. And the doctors were like, all the research from all around the world does not bear that out. That's not true. So, and they kept trying to provide data that showed that this wasn't true. And I remember listening to this going, they're not going to win with data because we're not wired for data. The reason those people believe what they believe is because they have a story. I knew somebody this happened to. I heard of a person this happened. That you can only win with another story. You're not going to win with data, right? So the thing is, you find a story, a human story about whatever you're talking about, because there is one. And when you find it, that's what people will latch on to. We're not wired for all that other stuff. We're not wired for charts and graphs and right. That's not the way it works. We're wired for stories. And we want to know, hey, how is what you're telling me going to help me? That's what we want to know. And so there is a story there. There always is. They just have to find it. How does this thing connect with me? You know, Steve Jobs was good at this. And I've worked with tech companies making pieces for them. And if they have a product, they often want to give you the stats. Do you remember there was a commercial, at least here, I don't know if it was everywhere, but there was a commercial for FaceTime. And when it first came out, there was a commercial for it. And the commercial was just people on the computers or on their phones connecting with other people. There was a guy who obviously was stationed somewhere, a military guy, and he sees his wife and their new baby over the thing, right? Somebody seeing a graduation, I think is one of all these things that connected people. Now I gotta have that. You're giving me emotional information, right? I don't know anything about technology. So you're not going to impress me with technology. You're going to impress me with how is this going to impact my life for the better, right? So they told you those little stories, those little vignettes, and it was a powerful commercial. I don't know if you've ever seen it. So an armature should be a sentence. So it should be something you can prove or disprove through the story, right? It has to be a sentence. So a lot of times people go, well, revenge, that's my theme or my armature. It's like, it can't be. Revenge is sweet, can be. Revenge harms the avenger, could be, right? It can't be friendship. It has to be friendships are sometimes complicated. Friendships are necessary, something like that, right? So companies can have armatures, right? They're all often looking for their armature. What's interesting is that Nike's armature is if you have a body, you're an athlete. right? And when you have a strong armature, it tells you what to do. If you have a body, you're an athlete, which they sort of contextualized as just do it. They did an ad with a kid, overweight kid, jogging. It's just one shot of him jogging and having a very hard time doing it, but doing it. And that's better than having a star. It's better than having, a lot of times clients used to come to us, the agency, and they go, well, we got this star and this song. It's like, yeah, but what are you saying? Because it won't matter, right? That was a very powerful ad, that kid just jogging and just doing it. And you were like, it was more impressive than the most impressive athlete. You had empathy for him. You had admiration for him. It was amazing. It's an amazing ad. And it's simple. Doesn't cost a lot of money. Doesn't have any special effects. Doesn't have any big stars, right? What was interesting is that Nike changed Just Do It for a while to be like Mike, to be like Michael Jordan. Be like Mike. Well, guess what? You can't be like Mike. If you have a body, you're an athlete. I can do that, right? But I can't be like Mike, right? You know? So they went back. They had to go back. That went away. If you have a strong armature, it's amazing. But what it does is sticking to your armature has a way of making your stuff resonate and be honest in a very specific way and feel polished. So it doesn't matter whether you're writing a story or whatever. It always helps. For instance, a lot of times people will write an email to somebody. And in the email, there's like 10 or 15 things to pay attention to. And then when that happens, a lot of things don't get addressed. If your armature is your subject and everything is dealing with that, and then if you have more to say, that's another email. This one's just about this. Now, all of a sudden, I've told people that, and I know other people I've worked with who've told people that, and all of a sudden, people are responding to their emails differently. Things are getting addressed that weren't getting addressed because they started with their armature. Because there's too much to pay attention to. Is this for me? Is this for somebody else? Is this, right? You know, especially if it's a group email, right? Who is this for? Am I supposed to do this? Right, right, you know. But if it's one thing, hey, Brian, take care of this thing. Oh, okay. Oh, one thing about point, which is interesting. So I've been teaching this a long time now, and I don't usually get new questions. But one day I got and it wasn't that long ago. Somebody had a question I'd never heard before. So I'm talking about having a point. And somebody says, what's a point? You know, I thought it was pretty self-explanatory. So, you know, but I try to honor the question, you know, and so I answered it, and I talked about armature, talked about having a point, and, you know, knowing what you want to say and all of that. And anyway, he got it. But afterwards I went, what is a point? I have to actually know that. So I looked it up. A point, the definition of a point, one of the definitions is the tapered, sharp end of a tool or a weapon. And I'm like, that's exactly what a point is in a story. Because you can weaponize. As a matter of fact, I actually don't believe that you can make a tool without also making a weapon. I think that they always go together, right? When we harness fire, that's a tool, but it's also a weapon, right? A hammer is a tool that could also be a weapon, right? Writing is a tool that can also be a weapon. Storytelling is a tool that can also be a weapon. I don't think you can make one without the other. It's just what you decide to do with it.
It's like different sides of the same coin, really.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. The tapered sharp end of a tool or weapon. And that's what a point is.
So what led to your updating The Invisible Ink? Could you tell us a bit about that, please?
It took me 6 years to get the book published, right? So I wrote it and it took forever to get published. And so I learned more. And when the book was finally going to get published, I thought, well, I know more now than I did then when I wrote this book. Do I amend the book or do I put it out the way it is? Well, I had been teaching, and the book was essentially what I had been teaching. And I knew it worked for people, and I knew it resonated with people. So I went, well, you know, this is fine. I'll just put this one out, and then later I'll know enough new stuff, right? You know, that I can put that in the book. And so that's what I did. I started teaching things that weren't in the book, and there were enough of them that I thought, okay, this is enough new stuff that I could justify a new book. And also I changed some of the language a little bit. Some of the language, there was some gender stuff in Invisible Ink that as the years went on, rubbed people the wrong way. And I understand that. And so I'm like, let me adjust that. It took me a while to figure out how to adjust it. But once I figured that out, because I wanted to be honest about the things I was observing, but I also didn't want to be stuck in a world, you know, the world moved on and I don't want to be stuck. So Now, in another 10 or 20 years, there might be stuff in the book that people go, I can't believe you wrote that, but there's nothing I can do about that. Right, right. But as long as I'm around to make changes, I'll make those changes. So that was some of it, but that was less of it than really I had more to say. And I found ways of being more clear. And over the years, I've gotten questions like people didn't know how to build a story using an armature. So I started teaching that more. And so that's in the book. And also, I talk about first acts more because I think the first act is so important and it's actually getting lost in Hollywood. I was told by an agent I had not to write a first act because they want to get right to the action. But the first act in a story, there's a lot of work it's doing. And one of the things it does is it creates a connection between the audience and the protagonist. So the difference is this. If I say there was a terrible car wreck yesterday. Okay. Oh, that sounds terrible. Was anybody hurt? Yeah. Your best friend was in a terrible car wreck.
That changes everything.
Everything. That's what the first act does. Oh, I know this person this is happening to, right? You eliminate that, you get all the spectacle and all that other stuff, but you don't care. That first act makes people care. So I focused on that a lot, and I talk about how to build a story from that armature, how that helps your first act, and how to build the rest of the story using that armature. So that's why I've changed the subtitle to Building Stories from the Inside Out, because that's more the focus of this book. Yeah, so that's why. Land of the Dead is my favorite of my books right now. It's because most of what I teach in some way or another used to be a lot of it was common knowledge up until about the 1920s. So all I've done is do a lot of studying and reading and all of that. The Land of the Dead has things in it that I haven't read other places. And I feel like it's my contribution in a different way to storytelling. I think I've added some vocabulary to storytelling, broadly speaking. There's one thing in particular in that book, angel characters. I talk about angels, not in a religious sense, but in a story sense and how they operate in stories. And I don't know if anybody's ever talked about it. And they may talk about it in somewhere, but they don't talk about anything I've read about story. And so, and there's some other things too in the Land of the Dead. I think I've added to the vocabulary. So I feel proud of that. I feel like I put my handprint on the cave wall with that book. We'll see. I don't know. People like what they like. I like that book. And the Golden Theme I like too. But those two for me, they're actually, in a way, opposite books, in a way, that one is about the underworld and the information and the lessons we get from the underworld, and one is the highest common denominator. It's really interesting. Yeah. But they're both, I think, positive. Some of the reviews about with Land of the Dead talk about how it's strangely positive given what it's about. And I'm proud of that. There's just a lot of things. I'm very proud of that book. And the memoir, which will be out who knows when, takes a long time. It's graphic. So it's being drawn. And that takes a long time. So hopefully it'll be out in another year or so.
Looking forward to that. So where can the audience find you if they want to reach out to you?
Well, they can go to my website, writeinvisibleink.com. They can do that. They can follow me on Instagram, which is @BMcD, and that's BEEMACDEE.
Okay.
Yeah. Those are the places where people usually find me, and they can write me from the website. And my classes are offered there. So I teach Zoom classes. So
do you have any final words for the audience?
I would say that to pay attention to the stories around you, pay attention when people talk. If you learn how to do that, you will learn everything you want to know about storytelling because it's in the natural world. You'll learn when you're bored, why you're bored, when you're engaged, why you're engaged. It's hard for people at first, but if they can learn, I say observe stories in their natural habitat, right? So the problem is when people are in a conversation, they're in a conversation and it's hard to observe and be in a conversation. But if you practice it, you can do it. And it's really interesting to hear somebody talk, and they'll talk in 3 acts. They'll have a proposal, they'll have an argument, they'll have a conclusion, and you'll hear it. And the reason I think that's important is because until you teach it to yourself, you will think, oh, what did Brian say? Or I think Brian's wrong about this, or this is his take. When you observe it yourself, you're teaching it to yourself. You don't have to listen to me at all. Teach it to yourself. It'll prove itself to you. And then that comes from a different place when you start using it. You're not following my rules, in quotes.
Or formula.
Yeah, right. And so I think that's really important that people have ownership over it and that they know that it's theirs and not, they're not painting by numbers.
Thank you, Brian. Pay attention to the stories around you. This has been an amazing conversation and my heart is full. And I want to say thank you so much for the generosity with which you've shared your wisdom, your experience, your knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. That's all we have for now. Thanks for listening. If you like this show, do subscribe at www.agileinnovationleaders.com. That's agileinnovationleaders.com or your favorite podcast provider. Also share with friends and do leave a review on iTunes. This would help others find this show. I'd also love to hear from you, so please drop me an email at ola@agileinnovationleaders.com. Take care and God bless.